Hello, everybody. My name is Małgorzata Bakalarz-Diverge. I am Director of Academic Programs at the Center for Jewish History, and I'm very happy to welcome you today to a fascinating conversation around Ayala Fader's new book, Hidden Heretics, Jewish Doubt in the Digital Age. The Center for Jewish History is a home for the archival collections of 5 partner institutions: American Jewish Historical Society, American Sephardi Federation, Leo Baeck Institute, YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, and Yeshiva University Museum. Together, those collections create the second largest archive of the Jewish experience in the world. Above all, though, the center aims to be a home for our growing academic community, inspiring encounters, exchanges of ideas, and conversations. And not only learning from the past, but also witnessing groundbreaking explorations of the current phenomena of historic significance. Let me introduce tonight's discussants. Ayala Fader is professor of anthropology at Fordham University. Her research interests include religious worlds, Jewish studies, gender, language, childhood, and media. She's the author of the award-winning book, Mitzvah Girls, Bringing Up the Next Generation of Hasidic Jews, and the co-founder of the Seminar on Jewish Orthodoxies at Fordham Jewish Studies. Michal Kravel-Tovi is a social and cultural anthropologist at Tel Aviv University. She is the author of the award-winning book, When the State Winks, The Performance of Jewish Conversion in Israel. She currently works on 2 projects. One traces the social life of Jewish continuity discourses and statistics in the American Jewish public sphere, and the second is concerned with an emerging Haredi Me Too movement among ultra-Orthodox communities in Israel. Finally, 2 reminders. You are welcome to write down your questions for the Q&A portion of our program. To do so, please use the Q&A function visible on the bottom of your screen. You can type your questions throughout the program. Secondly, our program is recorded and will be available via the Center's YouTube channel soon, and we will email you a link to the recording after it's posted. And now, without further ado, Ayala Fader and Michal Kravel-Tovi.
Thank you, Malgo. Thank you for this introduction, and thank you, Ayala, for the invite to take part in this celebration. As I think I told you, Ayala, while I was reading the book, I was conversing with you in my mind. So I'm very happy to have now a real conversation, well, as real as Zoom can get. Before I take a couple of minutes to describe what I love about the book, and before we begin our dialogue, I want first to invite you to read aloud the vignette from Hidden Heretics to present the book and provide some background and context.
Thank you so much, Michal. I want to thank the Center for Jewish History for having me and Michal for being in conversation. Someone whose work I admire so much and also who stayed up so late to be in conversation with me as she's in Israel. So yes, I will begin with a short vignette that will give you a sense of who the people are in Hidden Heretics. So Yisrael grew up Hasidic in Brooklyn, where like his peers, he spent long hours studying in yeshiva. When he was 13, he began to have questions, what are called aminikashas, or questions of faith. But when he asked his rabbi about them, he was told those kinds of questions came from masturbation. So he was silent and he stopped asking. He told me he pushed all of his questions under the rug. At 18, he got married to a woman he didn't know but grew to adore, Ruchi, and they quickly had 5 kids. But when he was 29, his questions started again. And because he, like so many other Hasidic men, had started working in computers, he had access to the internet, and he began to go online, reading biblical archaeology, philosophy. Late at night, when his family was asleep, he was alone in his kitchen, he began to go on the popular heretical blogs of the day, and then later on to chat rooms, arguing with other posters, trying to convince himself and others that the Torah was the word of God revealed to Moses or Moshe at Mount Sinai. And then late one night, Shabbos, when his youngest was crying, and he knew that turning on her musical mobile that hung above her bed would calm her down. Of course, ultra-Orthodox Jews don't use electricity on Shabbos. He paused. He put his hand on the switch. Yes, no, and he turned it on. And that was when he became what many in the community call Bahal Tanat Bikorsim, or hidden heretics, those who are living double lives, practicing publicly at home, practicing publicly even at home, but secretly with new friends, breaking Jewish law and exploring the wider world of New York City. But despite trying to keep his new beliefs and life secret from his family, of course his wife Ruchi noticed. And finally she asked him, did he still pray? Did he even believe in God? He confessed everything to her, talking late into the night in their bedroom closet so the kids wouldn't hear. She was devastated and told me she cried for 3 days. Was her husband crazy? Would she worry her own faith slip? How could she possibly take on responsibility for the spirituality of the house, which was traditionally the realm of her husband? Yisrael was desperate to regain his faith, and he sought out special outreach rabbis to help him, kiruv rabbis, but none did. And then finally, one day, the Modesty Committee, which is a shadowy group of self-appointed activists, called his house. They noticed that he had recently bought a book on science that included evolution for his young daughter. They wanted him to sign a contract, agreeing to stop going on social media. And they wanted him to go see religious therapists who would work closely with his rabbi. He went to a number of them for fear that his children would be expelled from school, which would have consequences for matchmaking later on. But nothing helped him. And that was when I met him, just as his world was falling apart. We were introduced by a mutual friend, and his story and how it affected his family is one of the many I analyze in Hidden Heretics. Of ultra-Orthodox Jews who are experiencing what I call life-changing doubt, but because of their families and fear, they cannot leave. They stay and try to figure out how to secretly build relationships, dreams, and desires, even while they pretend to live ultra-Orthodox religious lives. The internet plays a key role in their ability to stay, and the worlds they build with new friends and lovers unintentionally and intentionally may be changing Orthodoxy itself. So I'll say a few words now about some of the key issues in the book, right, Michal?
Right.
Yeah, okay, good. Just checking.
Go ahead.
And then we'll have our conversation. So let me say a few words first about doubt. I'd like to clarify that doubt is inherent to all religions. Doubt defines, it refines faith. It's expected, in fact, by religious leaders and religious participants both. It ebbs and flows over the life cycle. This is the kind of doubt that remains in individuals' interiors, and it doesn't really disrupt religious practice. My focus in Hidden Heretics, though, is different. It's what I call life-changing doubt, and it's the kind of doubt that challenges the entire theological structure of orthodoxy. Life-changing doubt refused to stay inside people, and it led people to disrupt or stop their religious practice. Often this kind of doubt makes people leave their religious communities, but those living double lives couldn't. They didn't want to hurt their families, or they were too scared to leave their communities. They felt they were unprepared to live outside of their communities, and so they stayed, keeping this dramatic personal change a secret. Eventually, many went online and found others, which created anonymous networks of doubters who over time began to also meet secretly in person and explore forbidden worlds together and break Jewish law away from the eyes of their families and their communities. Life-changing doubt had familial and communal implications in addition to this dramatic personal change. Even when kept secret, it affected spouses, children, and over the time I was doing fieldwork, it drew increasing attention from religious leadership, activists, and religious therapists, people who all tried to help those with life-changing doubt regain their faith. So let me just give you a little context for who these heretics are and the context that they're living. While the numbers of those living double lives and the fellow travelers with them are not really reliably known, I mean, I've heard individual estimates varying from 100 to tens of thousands worldwide. What is important, I think, is that they increasingly figure large in the ultra-Orthodox imagination, as do those who have left or gone off the derech or off the path, what many people call OTD. This is despite ultra-Orthodoxy's continued robust demographic growth. So with large families, in fact, these communities are growing, but there's a lot of concern about people who are leaving or people whose faith has somehow been challenged. Some religious authorities blame what they call a crisis of emunah or a crisis of faith on a religious orthodoxy that has gotten too stringent. Some blame trauma or mental illness, in a way pathologizing life-changing doubt. And others blame the internet, particularly smartphones, which created opportunities for private exploration and community building. I want to just point out that it's important to note that ultra-Orthodox Jews have not historically rejected new technologies, or science for that matter, out of hand, as long as science or that new technology could be redeemed through Jewish content or Jewish form. When I was doing fieldwork for my first project in the 90s, cassette tapes had long already become kosher because Jewish music could be recorded on cassette tapes. TV was not so easy to control, and that was forbidden by rabbis. VHS also, if you remember what that is, was outlawed while I was doing my fieldwork in the 90s. Over this past decade, though, the internet has become a flashpoint for what I see as a wider crisis of authority. Those living double lives tapped into a broader generational backlash of Hasidic and yeshivish men in particular in their late 20s, 30s, and 40s, who had become frustrated and cynical for a whole host of reasons. Some of which I'll just mention, the breakdown in political leadership, rabbinic leadership over succession, which really exposed a very human side of power struggles, the economic challenges of living in New York City, men with limited educations, especially limited fluency in English, were frustrated that they couldn't support their families. And finally, the sexual abuse scandals also created a lot of cynicism that the rabbis that so many had trusted to be their leaders and protect their children, in fact, were not doing so. So this broader context really set the stage for many living double lives who were fed up with what they called the system. And let me just conclude my portion by telling you a little bit about what anthropologists do and what my research consisted of. So anthropologists use a methodology called ethnography. Basically participant observation. So anthropologists participate in the community they're working in and they observe. So for me, for this project, over 5 years, I followed people living double lives where they let me. First online and then in person. I went to parties, to blogs. I hung out in bars late at night after all of our children were asleep. I was on closed WhatsApp groups. So the ethnographic research, the participant observation, took place on digital media, but also in face-to-face contexts. I had an unusual amount of access, something I hadn't expected, to hidden heretics because many of them wanted their story told. They wanted to show their world and the wider world that they were moral people who were making the best decisions they could in order to protect the families that they loved. One thing I realized midway through the research was that I had to account for the perspective of the religious therapists, the outreach rabbis, and the life coaches, all of those who were the sort of professionals who tried to help those living double lives when they were outed or discovered. Those ultra-Orthodox were much less, life coaches in particular, and some of the rabbis were less eager to talk to me. So it was a reverse of what I had expected, because they really didn't want to expose the kind of public doubt that so many of these Jews were experiencing and writing about. They didn't want to, as they said, air dirty laundry. And so, but one of the aspects of ethnography that I think is so valuable is with patients, you can always find people to talk to you. So over time, I did find life coaches, rabbis who would talk to me. Religious therapists were quite open, and I went to a religious therapist conference and multiple workshops. And I would say one of the real challenges throughout this research project, more than my first, certainly, was that I had to really protect the anonymity of the hidden heretics that I was working with, because there could have been very serious consequences for them with their families and their place in their communities. So I changed all of the identifying details. I changed the neighborhoods. I don't mention any particular Hasidic groups. And I have changed many of the personal details. And it is ironic, since ethnography in a way is a kind of revealing by the anthropologist of a community's secrets. The challenge for me was really to analyze the life stories and the people who were living them while still maintaining their anonymity.
Thank you, Ayala. Wonderful, wonderful. I was amazed when I read your first book, and now I admire once again how you write with clarity, concision, elegance, nuance, and substance, never compromising each of these components. The book is a compassionate and sharp story of the liminal space inhabited by double lifers. Ayala gives room to the richness of double life without flattening her numerous insights to one generalized statement, and without pretending to know everything. She writes candidly about the limits and discontents that are so integral to fieldwork and to scholarship, I think, more generally. For me, the book is just one of those books that remind me what a good, solid ethnography is all about. In other words, the book is a delighted read. But the book is not only that. The book foregrounds a myriad of issues informing the study of religion, including questions of ethics, social boundaries, the gendered nature of belief and disbelief, religious authority, and the links between religion and psychiatry. The book also captures some of the most profound features of Haredi publics, including some of the recent dramatic engines of change in contemporary Haredi life. To give only one example, it seems to me that double lifers stretch to its limit a quite common and normalized tendency of Haredi Jews to keep in secrecy certain aspects of their life. It is precisely by way of concealment that full-fledged mainstream Haredi Jews conform to Haredi norms while trying to avoid the totalizing communal gaze. Haredi Jews tend to place their TVs in the bedroom rather than in the living room. Many have two phones, one kosher and the other an unfiltered smartphone. And they often remain silent about personal and family issues that their disclosure may interfere with matchmaking chances. I am apologizing from the outset that we won't be able to do justice to the book, far from it. You will just need to go and read yourself. But we will try to at least expand on some of the issues that Ayala just briefly mentioned. A substantial part of the book explores the role of social media in cultivating or permitting what you just defined as a life-changing doubt. You write, Ayala, at some point that virtual spheres constitute a medium that gives voice to dissent. I'm having in mind the dissenting voice of one of your interlocutors who wrote online, and I quote, "The real world is here on social media, on WhatsApp. This is where I have the pleasure of living in an honest and open life. The real world is what keeps me from going insane." Can you please elaborate on how you understand the functioning of social media in the life of double lifers and how it gives particular shape to the personal experience of life-changing doubt and to the formation of a counter-public?
Yes, that's really central to the book in a lot of ways. So in my discussion of the internet and smartphones in particular, and their changing position in the communities over the past decade, I tried to toggle back and forth between hidden heretics experiences and perspectives and rabbinic leadership's experiences and perspectives. So let me begin with hidden heretics. One of the things that surprised me was that they all argued to me that their activity online didn't create their life-changing doubt. Everyone said it was actually books, secretly going to public libraries, hanging out in bookstores, that actually gave them the kind of material for other points of view. But what the internet did do, and this is what you were hinting at, Michal, is that it saved them from thinking that they were crazy or alone, because craziness or insanity is one of the explanations, or at least it was until more recently, in the community for life-changing doubt. And the activities online that they participated in, the chat rooms, the WhatsApp groups, Facebook eventually, it created what I called a heretical counter-public, which is a public that is critical of the general religious public in this case, and it was comprised of heretical ideas So first on blogs and then later on social media, I was able to follow the debates that were happening in real time and the ways that people's interactions online really built communities of like-minded questioners. I saw how skeptics and heretics criticized their communities. They asked forbidden questions. And those kinds of relationships formed online then began to spill over into face-to-face interactions. As people began to trust each other online, they decided it was worth the risk to try to meet up in person. And so they did. And all kinds of new relationships were formed, friendships between men and women, which is not usual in Haredi context, in ultra-Orthodox context, romances, affairs. Some men even began using language, Yiddish, in new ways to express themselves in new forms of writing. In contrast, the ultra-Orthodox rabbinic leadership over the same decade went from blaming the content of the internet, basically as a purveyor of pornography, to some saying that the medium itself was corrupting, especially smartphones. So that even one poster that was in a synagogue compared smartphones to secondhand smoke. You know, that even standing next to somebody using a smartphone could contaminate you and make you begin to doubt. Many called it the challenge of their generation. This is in almost cliche, not cliched, but it's very familiar language that rabbis have used over the decades, especially post-Holocaust. And they compared it frequently to other challenges to Jewish Orthodox existence. So very commonly to the Holocaust, to the Spanish Inquisition, to slavery in Egypt. One of the posters that circulated on social media that, of course, the heretical counterpublic then made fun of was an image of a cattle car going to Auschwitz saying, the Holocaust burned our bodies, but the internet burns our souls. So a lot of really strong imagery and sort of a different temporality, a different sense of timing. But one thing that ultra-Orthodox leadership couldn't do the way they had done with other media was fully censor the internet because too many businesses relied on it. So leadership began requiring filters in the mid-2000s, and they tied acceptance of computer and phone filters to kids' acceptance in schools, in the Mostis. So if you want your child to go to a particular ultra-Orthodox school, you sign a contract that says you will have a filtered phone. And if you need to have an unfiltered phone, you will have to go in and talk to the principal and say why you need that for work. Even despite this, many Hasidic men actually refused to give up their smartphones. As you mentioned, they had 2 phones, but the rabbinic leadership sensed that unlike actually yeshivish ultra-Orthodox men, for example, in Lakewood, who did give up their phones, Hasidic men didn't. And so ultra-Orthodox leadership began to appeal to women. I actually went to, in Williamsburg, to a phone exchange where women, Hasidic women, could go and bring in their smartphones and buy a kosher flip phone that was filtered, you know, as a way to really maintain the integrity of their homes. And women were given a kind of special responsibility by rabbinic leadership, even if their husbands were not being as diligent as they should with the internet, they were the ones responsible for the next generation. And I will also say that my sense of those two sort of polar opposites, like not at all and completely, my own sense is actually somewhere in between. I mean, scholarship tells us that a medium doesn't create doubt or faith, for that matter. It can uphold either one. But the internet, and particularly smartphones, I think did create a very safe, anonymous sphere where people could dissent. And that was something new, because there have always been people living double lives. I met older Hasidic men living double lives, but when they actually wanted to socialize, they had to leave their communities and they had a life outside, whether they went to the Jewish Theological Seminary or the Jewish reading room in the public library. But here you have people who could stay in their communities and form friendships, and that was a powerful thing.
I want to take you back to the term doubt itself, or in particular, life-changing doubt. We both use it in the singular, but this term actually emerges from the pages of the book as a highly stratified and diverse reality for people differently positioned within the Haredi community. Gender, social standing, family record, and economic affluence, all of these factors help condition particular expressions and meanings of life-changing doubt. It would be great to hear more about the workings of this spectrum.
Yeah. I have a lot of information on gender, and as you noted, there were some parts of social status that I had very mixed results on. So I'll talk about both. Let me begin with gender. What I learned, it was ironic. In my first book, I only talked to women, particularly moms and teachers and their daughters. In this book, I began my research and I realized I was only talking to ultra-Orthodox men. And I kept wondering why that was and where women were in all of this. And what I learned over time was that men and women have very different reasons for life-changing doubt and very different opportunities for expressing it, just as they also have very different access to internet technology and smartphones. So there were structural factors that determined opportunities and reasons, I would say. So at the point of marriage, which is quite young, 18 or 19 for ultra-Orthodox Jews, young women who've been pretty independent in high school are suddenly required to be at home. It's expected that they'll be home. Of course, they can socialize with their friends, but in the evenings, especially once they have children, they're expected to be at home. And if they're not, their husbands want to know why. The opposite is true for men. Young men who have been in yeshiva, from like 7 in the morning till 9 at night. Once they're married, even if they continue to learn Torah, they have a tremendous amount in comparison of independence. Men can drive. Many women in many communities of ultra-Orthodoxy don't, but they have a lot more flexibility in their time, and they are now in charge of their households, and nobody's really asking them where they're going. So I met a number of newly married men, for example, in Barnes & Noble's cafes around Brooklyn on weekday afternoons. Only an academic and an ultra-Orthodox newly married man could do that. But I was surprised at the amount of independence that young men had upon marriage. So that was one thing. The actual experience of life-changing doubt was very different also. A lot of men described for me the kind of devastation that they experienced when they had life-changing doubt. Some considered suicide. It was a kind of changing of their world that was a loss. It was experienced at a loss. Whereas for women, some also expressed that, but a number described feeling very angry. They felt angry that they had given up so much of what they themselves had wanted for a system they no longer believed in. And I think that speaks to the organization of gendered roles in that community, especially women who had, dreams of being intellectual or very pious and wanted to be rabbis. That's something that they couldn't be and in their communities. And when they came to think that perhaps the version of orthodoxy that they had learned was merely one version and not the truth, they were angry. I noticed that these kind of distinctions between the emotional and the intellectual also sort of filtered down to rabbis and therapists, because when a woman was discovered to have life-changing doubt, rabbis and therapists almost always suggested that there were emotional reasons at play. And for men, it was much more acceptable to say, well, he's just so smart, he has intellectual reasons. And maybe, his evil inclination is sort of goading him on to be too curious. But there was, again, like women were more emotional, men intellectual. And there were also consequences for kids. I think the women that I met were much more, everyone was worried to lose their kids in case there was a divorce in terms of custody. Usually the community puts all of their resources behind the person who's still religious, the spouse who's still religious, because there's the notion of saving the child. And so men and women were both terrified to lose their children, custody of their children, but women often had fewer resources, especially once they had a number of children. They often stayed home and didn't have income. So they had just fewer ways to go about changing their lives if they even wanted to. I will also say for the still religious spouses, men were humiliated in some ways publicly when their wife began to act up, and it could be embarrassing. But for women, there was actually a reorganization of the household where suddenly they were in charge, as Ruchi was, for the spiritual, the level of spirituality in the home. One wife I know had to suddenly make Kiddush because her husband, who no longer observed Shabbos, suddenly would not be able to touch kosher wine. And so that was not, I assumed, as a Jewish feminist, like, great, they have more authority. But in fact, that was seen as something wrong, as something shameful, something they had to hide from children. And as Ruchi said, it made her scared that her own faith would falter. In terms of social class, I think that's such an interesting question. I ask so many people, if you have a very high yichus, like if you come from a very prestigious family, which includes a combination of wealth and genealogy and how much learning you have in your family, is it easier? Do you have more leeway or less leeway? And I got very mixed results. Some people said, if you come from an important family, you have less leeway because you're a role model for the family. Others said, if you come from a powerful family, you have more leeway because your family allows you to, do what you want. You can hide it better. So I don't really have hardcore information on that.
You already mentioned Ruchi and not only Israel, right? Because some of your account has to do with the family of double lifers. Some of the protagonists, like Israel in the book, are tragic heroes, tormented with lies, deceptions, and compromises. But their moral dilemmas also implicate and burden their families, like Ruchi, who need themselves now to navigate a certain double life. A compelling contribution of the book is how you extend your discussion beyond the suffering of struggling double lifer like Israel as an individual to explore how family members carry the weight of a double life. As one spouse said, I'm carrying a burden until forever. Can you tell us some more about the idea of a family morality and share what surprised you the most in how family members handle these morally laden circumstances?
Yes, I didn't intend to actually study families at all, but I realized that I couldn't just focus on individuals because these individuals were actually defined by their families in a lot of ways, as I think everybody is really. And my hope is that the study of ethics and morality can move beyond the individual and focus on families and senses of obligation. One of the sort of features of living a double life is embracing an alternative set of ethics or moral values, ones that are in conflict with the values that they have grown up in. So many double lifers, for example, adopted secular liberal values of pluralism, tolerance, individual autonomy, choice. And double life parents were in this really precarious kind of situation where they wanted to share the new sense of ethics that they had with their children. And yet it had to be expressed so subtly because they didn't want to confuse their children or get them in trouble or expose themselves to the wider, even to their spouse or to the wider community. I think one thing that really surprised me, I had assumed that all of the parents living double lives would want their children to grow up to be secular and leave their communities, or at least to engage more with the secular world. But that wasn't true at all, which is one of the strengths really of the ethnographic method. It forces you to confront your own preconceptions. What I did hear across the board was that all of the hidden heretics wanted their children to have a choice. It was something that they felt that they didn't have growing up. And so they wanted their children to know about the wider world, but to be able to choose if they just wanted to stay religious or not. So they began to make very small changes. Their goal was to turn them into, for example, critical thinkers, to be a little bit more tolerant, to learn to use Google, to value diversity. One of the women I talked to wouldn't let her children call the cleaning lady the goita, like goy, feminine goita. She asked them to learn her name. She said, even Gentiles are people. And, she also let her kids touch her hair when her husband wasn't home. men did other things. They had more authority in their home, so they were able to sometimes challenge their children's teachers. For example, I always think about and laugh about the story of a man whose child every Rosh Hashanah brought home arts and crafts picture of a pomegranate. The teacher had told the children that in this pomegranate, there's always 613 seeds for all of the commandments. And this hidden heretic used to say to his children, okay, get the knife, bring the pomegranate, let's count them. And his wife got very upset and left the room. One thing that was actually much more troubling was how difficult a double life parent could be on teenagers. I mean, anyone who has a teenager knows that they don't get kind of snowed for very long. They usually quickly figured out that something was amiss with their parents. Some became more religious. Some felt they had to protect themselves, and they reached out to extended family. They had to protect themselves from the influence of their own parents, which was very troubling. Others judged their parents and said, oh, their parents, their control over their baser instincts just isn't strong enough. I was very fortunate to talk to one teenager who I call Leah. And I had one interview with her, and she was talking about her experiences. I hadn't told her very much. I knew her mother was living a double life. I didn't know if she did. And suddenly in the middle of the interview, she started crying and she said, I know you know about my mother. So we stopped the interview. I felt terrible. And then a few months later, she called me back and said, I want to do another interview. And she came to my office this time. And she said, she was very angry. And she said, I want to tell all those people living double lives out there, it's not good for your kids. It confuses them. And I want you to know that you're doing the wrong thing. And we had an interesting back and forth where I said, but look, you've made your own choice to be religious and to stay religious and lead a religious life. And she said, that's what my mother said. But I think there were all kinds of moral compromises and painful kinds of negotiations that parents who are living double lives had to continuously make.
This last story of this teenager girl has something to tell us about how the people that we meet during fieldwork tend or wish to make use of our own, voice and platforms so it's always reciprocal. I want to go back to the crisis of Emunah, or the crisis of the internet. The concept of religious therapy that you also mentioned constitutes a key part of how Haredi authorities, both religious and professional, try to cope with the internet crisis and life-changing doubts. They do so by conflating religious doctrines with the oft medicalized language of popular psychology. Could you please tell us some more on how a sector so heavily governed by theology and religious schemes adopts and adapts to rationales, jargon, and bodies of knowledge associated with psychology? What are the key translations, but also mistranslations, the benefits, but also glitches of this intersection between religious and therapeutic lingo?
Yeah. I had never intended to study therapy. I didn't even know there was such a thing as religious therapy. Again, when I was doing my first fieldwork project, no one went to therapy except for secretly. It was considered a mark on the family. So between the late 90s to the contemporary period, there was a big shift in how therapy was conceptualized within the community. A large part of that was actually thanks to Rabbi Twersky, who recently died, who remade, actually created in some ways religious therapy by marrying Musar, which is ethical writings and texts, Jewish ethical writings and texts, with the self-help movement, particularly like AA, the Alcoholics Anonymous, the 12-step program. So in fact, in some ways, the notion of the person in Jewish religious therapy changed so that mental illness was no longer seen as such a negative weakness on the part of a person. Instead, it was seen as a medical problem, something that could be fixed. So in some ways that was very positive. More people have been going to therapy. There's a therapist organization. On the sort of flip side of that is that when a spouse was discovered to have life-changing doubt, after being sent to a rabbi and often a life coach, usually one of those people referred, or an outreach rabbi, usually that person was referred to a religious therapist, not so much for the doubt, but for the emotional fallout of life-changing doubt, which could be so profoundly unsettling. But in some cases, this had some really negative, even dangerous consequences for those therapists who were not completely trained. And there were some, I mean, there was a whole spectrum from, PhDs to those who had just felt that they were good listeners. But for the majority, doubt was kind of pathologized. It was treated as something wrong with a person. And the feeling was that if the emotional problem could be cured, preferably quickly, which meant medication or maybe cognitive behavioral feedback, then the doubt would go too. So the baseline of a normal, healthy person was somebody who had kept their doubts in check and was able to simply proceed as a religious Jew. One of the implications of this was it created a triangulated care between rabbis, therapists, and the patient. I went to a really interesting religious therapist conference where a rabbi and a therapist said, when do you refer to a patient to a rabbi, and when do you refer a patient to a therapist? And the speaker compared the notion of guilt. He said, sometimes guilt is a very productive emotion for sin, and it makes you repent. And sometimes guilt is a mental health issue where you're feeling guilty and it's not really your fault and you need some kind of intervention. The danger of this, besides not respecting patient-client confidentiality, was that it could have very negative consequences with the potential for misdiagnoses. So I tell the story of Javi, who shared her story with me, who was misdiagnosed multiple times. She was basically experiencing life-changing doubt and was dissatisfied with her life, but she was diagnosed as having bipolar, as being bipolar. She was medicated. Finally, after several years of being on a really serious medication, she did some research online and she realized, like, this is not me. I am not this person. I don't have these features. And so she told her father, her therapist, and her rabbi, who had all been working together, that she was going to refuse to take her medication and she wanted to see a therapist who was not affiliated with any of them. And she went to a Jewish therapist, but who was not Orthodox. And the therapist, who I later interviewed, she was gracious enough to talk to me, said that she had seen a number of hidden heretics. They had all referred to her. And her sense was that people with life-changing doubt had serious issues of depression and anxiety because it's a very difficult situation to be having, as she said, a love affair with two cultures, but that they weren't necessarily mentally ill and they certainly didn't need medication. They needed a place to talk. And so that's what she offered. And that's why so many hidden heretics referred their friends to this particular therapist and a group of trusted therapists, because therapy could be a way that they could actually both feel sane and make some serious decisions that they had to make with both their spouses and for themselves.
Thank you.
Then I would suggest that we start with the question that actually does relate to methodology. What language did you use for conducting your fieldwork?
I used English. I learned Yiddish in graduate school, actually at the YUVO summer program. And it was vital that I knew Yiddish. Because I had to do a lot of reading, online reading in Yiddish. A lot of men's postings were in Yiddish, but everyone was relatively fluent in English. Certainly women were. Of course, men who were hidden heretics, actually one of the signs that they had to be careful about of being too open-minded was that their English got much better. So they were quite comfortable talking to me in English. And I was more comfortable in that too, but it was important to know Yiddish. One of the interesting things for me was the men's Yiddish writing actually had much more influence from Hebrew, from Lashon Kodesh, from the liturgical Hebrew, and Talmudic references that I didn't understand. whereas women's influence in their Yiddish was much more from English. So I hired a Yiddish translator to work with me and go through some of the translations. And sometimes she had to ask her husband or her son as well, because even though she was so fluent, there's men's and women's Yiddish can be quite different in terms of how much Hebrew and how much allusion or incorporation of Talmudic references.
Mm-hmm. And do any of your subjects self-identify as heretics?
Yes, some do. There was, that's a great question. So there is a whole, I didn't really talk about this, but there was a whole continuum. I called it a continuum of doubting. At one end are people who call themselves, and the terms themselves are very important, and they're in different languages. So you could be aufgeklärt, which means enlightened, which refers to the Jewish Enlightenment, actually, the Haskalah, meaning that you don't necessarily break religious law, but you're open. You might read biblical archaeology, but you still practice in private and in public. Some people did call themselves apikorsim, and that term hidden heretic is not one that I made up. It's a local term that people use themselves, of bahaltana apikorsim. So all the way at the other end were heretics, and even beyond heretics, there were atheists. In English, that word atheists. So you could be just a doubter, you could be a koifer, you could be a hidden heretic. And so there was a whole spectrum. I actually had assumed that everybody would become an atheist, but that wasn't true at all. The majority, I would say, stopped believing in Matan Torah, in the giving of the Torah, that God actually gave the Torah to Moses at Mount Sinai, but that didn't mean that they didn't believe in God or weren't spiritual.
Mm-hmm. Were most of your interviewees from the US or from Israel?
They were all from the US. I talked to one person, I talked to one person in Israel and one person in Europe, but everyone else was from the US. I really am an anthropologist who focuses on the US.
Mm-hmm. And in terms, to sort of follow up on what you have just said about atheists or not, or like, different position on the spectrum of spirituality, do any of your hidden heretics find their ways to other Jewish denominations?
Yes, that's really interesting. Let me just say before I answer that, I think that's a problem that I only focus on the US. I mean, what we know is that Haredim, or ultra-Orthodox Jews, are transnational. In fact, there's so much moving around, crossing borders, national borders. It's difficult for one person to do all of that, but that's why I'm so happy to talk to Michal and other people who are working in different spots, because together we can sort of form a picture of the similarities and differences. There was a big outreach, not big, but there was an outreach movement from modern Orthodox Jews to try to appeal to hidden heretics. They thought it was obvious that people should just become modern Orthodox. And in fact, one of the therapists said to Javi, whose story I told, like, why don't you just become modern Orthodox? It's a no-brainer. You'll be able to live in both worlds. That didn't work at all for hidden heretics, in part because they had been raised that any other form of Judaism besides ultra-Orthodoxy was not authentic, in part because of the sensibilities of ultra-Orthodoxy, which they loved. What really surprised me in some ways was many of them began to think about ultra-Orthodoxy as a kind of lifestyle or a sensibility. And when they had opportunities, they explored New York City, but they often explored Jewish New York City. And they often met, on the eve of many holidays, and they ate Jewish, not even Jewish, but ultra-Orthodox foods that I found very alien. And they sang ultra-Orthodox songs together. Men and women were singing them together, but they were still singing those songs. They weren't singing, Pink Floyd. So I date myself, but the thought of moving to ultra-Orthodoxy really didn't answer their needs. They wanted to, and so what I've seen actually is a lot of hidden heretics, if they can, sometimes, and people who leave too, sometimes move to the outskirts of ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods and sort of live with one foot in each world. But there is a new kind of way of being ultra-Orthodox, which some people call Hasidish light or modern Hasidish. light as in L-I-T-E, which is a kind of sensibility of ultra-Orthodoxy without the stringency in terms of piety and interpretation of halakha.
I would just like jump in and say that this is really strong in Israel. There is a whole emerging sector of new Haredim.
Is that what they call themselves, new Haredim?
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting too, right? Yeah.
Like either modern Haredim, but usually, or new Haredim, yeah.
Yeah. And that goes along, I think, with some of the new forms of spirituality, like Breslov and stuff, right? Like there's and kind of hippie, no, totally different?
No, it goes more like the upper middle class, the internet, professional identity, Zionism.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Well, it's also interesting to hear what I'm hearing in your conversation, in your exchange, is this self-identification and the language that is used to self-describe. I also think that that's something very interesting to watch. Who is new and who is light, right? Exactly. And what does it mean, and what kind of consequences it has? What does it say about the path, the trajectory, that the values that move there? Okay, so the next question that we have is, the women who led double lives become invested or interested in modern feminism?
Yeah, that also kind of surprised me, not that much. I think gender was one of the hardest things to kind of change in some ways. I mean, I noticed that hidden heretic men were very quick to embrace, kind of liberalism, Democratic Party, tolerance, all those things. But their sense that there were innate differences between men and women, that didn't change so much. And sometimes there were issues with how men and women interact, men assuming that women hidden heretics or women living double lives were kind of promiscuous. So making assumptions based on the idea that once out of the fold, a woman's promiscuous nature would just run rampant. Women, I didn't hear that much talk about feminism. There was some disgruntlement. There was anger, not more than disgruntlement. There was anger when men didn't know how to behave. And one woman who was living a double life said to me, like, is it normal when a man asked me to sit on his lap in front of my husband? I was like, no, that's not normal. But there was, I think, because the men and women grow up in such almost distinct worlds, despite, the centrality of family, there was a big learning curve in how to interact with each other. And I didn't see, and I would expand this in terms of feminism and kind of the embrace of I didn't see hidden heretics want to live my life, for example. I sort of assumed they would want to be secular, more or less, and live out in the world. But they also, like many ultra-Orthodox, do see the kind of drawbacks to living a more, if we're going to say, secular life, like lack of centrality of family for some people, and loneliness, and having to choose between career for women and family sometimes. So they were critical, and they remained critical. That interested me a lot.
What possessed you to do this massive project? Has anyone in your personal experience had doubts?
What's the last part of that question?
I'm sorry. Has anyone in your personal experience had doubts?
Oh, that's interesting. I would say the kind of broader framework for my book, and what I sort of hope people will take away, is there are so many situations where beyond religion, people actually radically change the kind of set of ethics and beliefs about the way the world is organized from what they grow up with. So I'm interested in that in general. But this project sort of came to me unexpectedly. I had finished my first book, and I thought, well, I have one more article in me. I really was curious about the blogs, the Hasidic blogs in particular, that had grown so popular while I was writing my book, and my first book. And I thought, I'll just interview a few people and write one more article, and that's it. Then I'm done. I'm going to switch topics. And then as I began to interview a few people, there were so many fascinating changes that were going on in the ultra-Orthodox community that had so changed from even a decade prior when I had been doing my own research. Ethnographic research takes a long time. I couldn't resist it. And then right as I was deciding, like I didn't even know that I knew that there were people who had left, but I didn't know about this group of people who stayed despite their changes in terms of doubt. So I got very curious about that. And then the anti-internet rally in 2012 happened in Citi Field. And I just knew I had to figure out what was going on. It was too fascinating to me. But no one in my immediate family is ultra-Orthodox. I actually have an uncle who became Baal Tshuva, but so the reverse process. But no, in some ways, I think this is how I do Jewish, maybe, is my research is also, I think, a sense of my own participation in Judaism to the extent that I can.
The majority of Haredim voted for Trump. How about the doubters?
Yes, really great question and very important. The doubters didn't. There was in fact, I was kind of shocked by the 2016 and then the 2020 election. And that's something that I've begun working on, the overwhelming Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox vote for Trump. And I'm not alone in noticing that. And in responses to the pandemic, and even earlier in terms of the measles, explosion that happened in 2019. The double lifers who I could no longer see because of the pandemic, we were all home, but I continued to talk to them on WhatsApp. They were all real critics of Trump and were very critical of their communities in terms of not sheltering in place, not wearing masks. One thing that really fascinated me was actually wearing a mask eventually became a sign that you were perhaps more open-minded, that you trusted Dr. Fauci, perhaps, that you believed in the public health mandates. So even the mask, as it has become so politicized in wider America, had its own version of that in the ultra-Orthodox community. And I think what we're seeing, and this is what I'm going to be pursuing, is the vote for Trump, I think, speaks to a kind of wider sense of ultra-Orthodoxy having this moment where they can make alliance with people like Christian nationalists, and that idea of religious freedom folded into whiteness really is a kind of changing the conversation to a place where ultra-Orthodox Jews want to participate to some extent. Of course, there are some people who didn't vote for Trump, but overwhelmingly they did. And I think that speaks to the kind of shift from talking about themselves as a minority group with rights to talking about religious freedom. And that affects a lot of their lives just politically in terms of how politically involved they are, who they align themselves with, where they get information. I think it has a lot of big consequences in terms of their involvement as citizens in the US.
This was the last question we had time for. I mentioned in my introduction that we tend to learn from the past at the Center for Jewish History, but we're also very proud to participate in projects that are of historic significance. That's definitely the project that I had in mind when I was mentioning that about the center. Thank you very much, Ayala. Thank you very much, Michal. Very timely project, very timely conversation that I'm sure illuminated a lot of things we would like to know even more about. So thank you for that. Center for Jewish History is a proud host of conversations like the one tonight. If you enjoyed the conversation, if you want more conversations like that to happen, please consider donating. You can do that on our website. As I mentioned during the introduction, this program is recorded and we will send all the attendees the link once the program is processed and available on our YouTube channel. I strongly encourage the academics, and I saw that there is many of them among attendees tonight, to use this program in their educational practice and to let us know how it went and how the students use it to inform their own studies of Judaism, of Jewish trajectories, if you will. Thank you again. Let's meet soon at the Center for Jewish History and beyond. And let's definitely meet again discussing the book. I hope that all of you are going to read it. Thank you very much. Good night.
To you both. Thank you so much.